to present, or I'll do an 8-hour presentation seminar day. So I'm going to try to give you a bit of an overview. And two things are going to come together today. One is that I'll speak about executive function the way that I wrote about it in the book, the book that's on the table, which I wrote with the intention of reaching the population of students who I work with primarily in my private practice. They're very often middle school, high school, college-age students who are struggling with executive issues, and their parents might also be struggling. So these students will come and see me in a private setting, and the parents very often, I would say about 80 to 90% of the time, sit and in on the session because they need to know this as much as the students do. But one of the reasons that it is so important is because all of us know about executive function. And if you don't know, you can look it up. The information is available to everybody. I'm not going to spend much time restating information that you can get anywhere. What I do want to spend our time today doing is interpreting and translating. Because when you hear a student is struggling with executive function, the stories are strikingly similar. But student to student, the reasons that it's happening are different. And that's what we want to try to tease out a little bit when we speak about executive function. And then it's different again when you speak about autism. So what we're going to be talking about today, is the first and only big word that I'm going to use is what I base a lot of my work on, the term Salyut Oh Genesis. Many of you may have already come across this term, but it was a term coined by Aaron Antonvosky in, I think, the 50s. He was working on some research. He was a psychologist, an Israeli-American, and one of his research projects was to answer the question, why did some postmenopausal women who survived the Holocaust seemingly survive better than others? What was the difference? The experience was profound, it was huge, so why were the outcomes for the experience of the individuals so different? And this is where he came to this term that it was based on Salyut Oh, health, Genesis, origin of, where did their health come from, or where was it blocked? You can ask the same question of any student. Where are they getting, what is the source of their health, and what is being blocked? Antonvosky spoke about a sense of coherence that arises in people who seemingly survived, coming out of these three things. A sense of comprehensibility. They understood what was going on. Ask that question of the students you work with. Do they understand what's happening to them? A sense of meaningfulness or relevance. Do they have a sense that what's happening to them has any relevance to them? And a sense of manageability, which means that they can handle it. They know what to do. They've got the tools that they need to deal. And when we ask these three questions, very often when the student is in our mind's eye who's struggling with executive function, one or the other of these areas is not working very well. Or there's a disconnect. Or one is working but the other not. So when I speak about a salutogenic approach, this is essentially what I'm talking about, that the person, the executive functioning of the individual needs to have the balance of understanding, relevance, and a good toolbox. What happens when we speak about autism then in relation to executive function? The person with autism can be said to be a person that has what I put as this first bullet point, that can be seen as more chaos in the mind space as the experienced from inside. Now, a lot of times I'm going to be referring to not just small children, because small children start with a kind of a global awareness, and these experiences that I'm talking about, the executive functioning, we start asking students as they get into middle childhood, middle school, high school, to be more and more responsible for their executive functioning, even though it does start in early childhood. I'm really kind of targeting my comments to a span of childhood, not just this young child. The autistic experience can be structured via the use of executive function. I have a book with the same publisher in draft form. I'm hoping it comes out in about spring, we're hoping. And one of the statements I make in that book is that it is more important to teach the autistic person good executive skills than it is to teach social skills. And that's a kind of a strong statement, a little bit of a challenging statement possibly, because we're so used to thinking of autism as being primarily an issue of a disturbance in the social realm. And I would posit that it is actually as much of a disturbance in the executive realm, which then has its effect in the social realm. So as we go through today, just have that in the back of your mind as a question. Is this possibly important and true? The more functional the executive functions are, the more functional the social skills will become. That's exactly what I was just saying. And then autism requires more executive structure and more precise executive function than normalcy. And this is going to be something I'm going to refer to frequently also, that with autism there is greater sensitivity and greater precision. So if you think about that as we go through today and see where that might actually affect the ability of the autistic person to use, incorporate, and make cohesive their three areas of comprehensibility or thinking, relevance or their feelings, and their ability to act, their toolbox. How we think, feel, and act. This is what we refer to, and what I refer to in this book that's coming out, as autistic subjectivity. How each of us experiences the world. There's a kind of understood quality for most of us in the room, but the minute you add the autistic experience into the mix, you get a very unique set of subjectivities that are based on this greater precision and greater sensitivity that needs to be acknowledged. So basically, the foundation of what we're talking about when we speak about executive functions as they express themselves in the autistic experience, what we're really talking about is a kind of perception focus. So if you think of a kaleidoscope and you look through, you've got very precise focuses all through, but every time your eye moves a tiny little bit, you have another focus, but it's quite precise, it's quite specific. You can't say that the kaleidoscope allows you a feeling of the whole. You can say that the kaleidoscope gives you many individually precise experiences that are all a little different from one another. Trying to integrate these is what the autistic person is trying to do all the time. We all know that when we're trying to process any input from the world, most of us use one of our sensory vehicles to do that. We're using all the time, levels and levels and levels of sensory vehicles in order to process our engagement with the world. If it's true that most of us are able to do that because we have the capacity to integrate our senses, one of the things that I think is tricky to understand is that sensory integration is too much of an experience for the autistic person. They can handle, rather, sensory coordination. They can coordinate one or two. And I'm speaking in generalities right now, and each one of you are thinking of a very specific autistic person at a very specific age, and we know that the spectrum is gigantic. So for the sake of this 1 hour, I have to stick a little bit to the more general statements, but I'm hoping that you'll understand. You take any one of these thoughts, apply it to an individual, and then you can tease out some finer detail. But if it's so that the autistic experience is one that can handle sensory coordination, but not sensory integration, then we'll maybe understand why we have to back up a couple of steps. I'll give you a small example. A child in a classroom, maybe 3rd grade, 4th grade, is having very, very strong difficulties processing whatever is going on in the moment. There's something that has triggered a reaction in this autistic child. This is not a severely and deeply autistic child, but it's a child who has autism, but is also in an active school situation, able to learn. Teacher walks up to that child and begins engaging with eye contact, starts speaking, we're already on overload, and then does the unthinkable, either touches the child directly or even puts their hand on their desk, and boom, you have an electric overload. Because you never figured out what caused the difficulty in the first place. And in the first place, the difficulty was caused because the child had noticed that there was something different in the room, and that child's sense of structure and architecture had been changed. They hadn't yet accommodated that change. And now you have added to the visual field by stepping inside the visual field. And now, instead of asking how many more inputs can this child coordinate, you've added the voice and the touch, and now we're on overload. And so now you think, okay, now we have a meltdown, and now you have to deal in this big, big way with the meltdown, when it really, if you can trace it back, started with sensory integration being asked of a child who could barely manage sensory coordination. It's just a different way of looking at it. It's a slightly different turn of the dial of something that you're all very familiar with. But that turn of the dial gives a different way of seeing how profoundly these things impact what then is the next thing, which is what we're asking the child to do, which is to use their executive skills to listen to what the person is saying, the teacher or whatever, or socially interact with their peers, and proceed through the day processing all of this input on multiple levels. And we aren't actually recognizing that the processing demand got too big in the first 2 seconds of school. So let's keep moving on, but those kind of general comments keep in the back of your mind. Now, we know that executive function, one of the things that we do know about it is that wherever you look for information about it, you're going to find different information. We don't have the accepted definition. You're going to find different words that are being used by different authors. You'll find that different definitions are given to these words, etc. So that's why I don't want to go down the road of the sort of dictionary definition, because there is no common agreement about exactly how to define and how to speak about executive function. And up until the time that I wrote the first book, there was even more opportunity to kind of say it the way you saw it. So this is the way I saw it, because this is what students walked in the door with. So this is really based on, this particular list is not based on anything other than this is what I saw every day in my practice. You all know about this one, right? Why this is an important picture? The American Medical Association about 10 years ago did a whole conference on this picture, because you know that it's the picture of the God figure touching the finger of Adam, the human being, giving the spark of life. What is what they did their study on is that this is an exact picture of the human brain and its functions. The prefrontal lobe, where the executive functions live, the language centers, there are different faces, different angels in there, and the different centers for language or movement or whatever. And they did this entire neurological study on the accuracy of this brain, and that the figure of God sitting on the top of the brain stem, and giving the most human of all capacities through that creative touch to Adam. That's our executive function. So it's just a wonderful, that there's some deep truth in all of this. No matter how many different ways we try to describe it, sometimes all you have to do is just see this is true. All right, now this one I only put in there because I want you to just get a sense of, this is Russell Barkley. It's adapted because it was longer. And you hand a definition like this to a parent, and they look at you and they say, "Are you kidding? What does that mean?" I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of a hard time with nonverbal spatial temporal working memory, and I'm looking at my 10-year-old and trying to figure out what you mean by nonverbal spatial temporal working memory. Now, if you're in research, neurological research, that phrase is not going to stumble you up. But if you're like me, it doesn't help. So what does help? And that's where we want to go. What this slide says in essence is very simple. And this is what parents need to know. That every child needs to learn how to reflect on what happened, take that reflection into the present moment with whatever needs to be done or decided, and make a plan for action. Whether it is, if I jump up out of my chair, the last time I did that, the teacher got mad at me, I think I'm not going to do that. How quickly that nanosecond happens inside the brain of a child. We depend on this happening for social stability. We have to learn how to do that, and we have to learn how to do it so quickly that we don't know that we're doing it. But if you slow it down, that's exactly what we're doing. We're asking the child to reflect on what happened, assess it in relation to the moment's need, and make a decision about the future. And that's why these phrases are in such a complicated definition, such as rehearing and re-seeing the past, so that you can assess and make a goal-oriented new decision. It's not that complicated, but you have to put it into slow motion to get it. One of the primary sources of executive activity lies within our realm of the ability to pay attention. Now, very briefly and very quickly, I'd like to just ask you, what did you notice when you first walked in this room today? You in the middle with the brown sweater. What did you notice when you walked in?
The camera.
What did you notice? First thing that came to your mind?
Me?
Yeah.
The person signing.
Good. What did you notice?
That the room was empty.
Good. What did you notice, Mr. Gentleman?
The table with all the material.
Okay. And one more person, maybe you in the blue sweater, blue.
I noticed the screen and the projector.
Okay. Now, every single time you walk into a space, you're going to notice something with your active attention. Right? You're going to see things. The minute you've recognized it, it becomes your passive attention. So right now, your active attention is on what I'm trying to say, and whether or not you're able to follow. Your passive attention is on What do you have to do as soon as you get back to your desk? How much of my lunch can I get down before I have to leave? What's everybody else doing? If I don't write notes, how am I going to remember? Oh, that's right, it's being filmed. You know, this afternoon after work I have to do whatever, and then tomorrow I also have to, yes, she's still talking, okay, I'm back. That is normal. But that has to do with active and passive attention. And it's actually something that nobody ever talks about, but our students are affected by active and passive attention. Take that student that had the meltdown in class. Their attention was fully engaged on that change in the room that was so disturbing that nothing else was actually possible to process. Everything else became overload. What do you have when you have ADHD? You have some very interesting, and we could talk literally for a week about active and passive attention in relationship to ADHD and how many different ways this can show and what we can do about it. That could be an entire seminar. But just to very briefly give you a sense of active attention is what the student with ADHD is trying to achieve. And what are they doing to get there? They are using the same sensory processing channels as everybody else, but they're using sensory input as a tool to get their attention to go where they want it to go. Why do you think ADHD a hyperactive type is called hyperactive type? Because they're using movement, sensory sound, fiddles, touches, to keep their attention switch on. Their attention switch is so greasy that once they put it on, it immediately starts falling down again. And all of the movement and the noise and the activity and the engagement that makes everybody crazy is what's trying to keep their attention switch up. Now you take the child with ADHD, the inattentive type, their switch goes down just as fast, and they're happy to let it just stay. And they're sitting there looking beautifully attentive, and they're on an attention vacation. They're not there. In order to get them back, some kind of sensory stimuli will have to happen, either self-created or externally provided, to get that switch back and engaged. And then you have the combined type. Now you extrapolate that very, very simplistic explanation of attention into these millions of varieties that our children present to us, depending on their age, and then you understand why it is so absolutely true that if you have ADHD, you automatically have executive dysfunction. And you get it then. You understand that connection. It is very rare, but it can happen that you can have executive dysfunction in other areas and simply not have ADHD. That's possible. Your executive functions can be off track and it not be ADHD. But if you have ADHD, it's so pervasive, it will mean that you also have executive dysfunction. And so we could talk literally for a long time. How does this work with the autistic person? Well, think about what I just said about the senses, and you'll have a very good segue into what this might be like. Now we all know that attention, I'm not going to repeat what's on these slides, but I just want to say I gave these to you because the attention controls are a very important way to differentiate what is actually happening for a given child. So the mental energy control might be an important control to understand. It also might be that it's their processing controls that we really have to deal with. And that saliency determination is the only other word that you probably should really pay attention to. Because one of the tricks with attention issues is that it's very difficult to determine what's important. Right now, you've determined, because you're sitting here, that it's important to listen to what I say. So that you've got. Now, the next level of saliency determination is to try to figure out, of all these words that I'm using, which ones are relevant to you? Which ones are useful to you? Which ones are important? That is a much harder task. And what we're asking our students to do is to engage in saliency determination absolutely non-stop, morning, noon, and night. And we get very agitated with them when that saliency determination capacity fails them and they stop being able to determine what's important to pay attention to. And so then we step in and we give them a redirect, and it usually is with some kind of extrasensory push because we are intuiting that they need the sensory input. We might raise our voice, we might walk over to them, we might give them something to do, we can do, and sometimes the things that we do are all perfectly legitimate. I don't mean to say that they're not legitimate, but they need things like that to be brought back on track if they can't hold the track themselves. And most students, whether or not they have ASD, whether or not they have ADHD, I don't care what alphabet they belong to, no child under the age of 60 can hold their attention without fail. I've watched in this room, we have among you as adults, you've come in and out. It's like watching pulsing. And that is so normal. We need to understand that it's okay. But because you are adults who have some experience with your own pulsing, you know how to bring yourself back if you can't hold it in a focus. And what do you need to do? And this is the thing that I work a lot with my students and whatever alphabet the student belongs to. Understanding that your attention decision, and I don't know if I could point out one or two things that I've seen today, but for example, if a person were to come into this room and be listening, and within about 5 minutes, the eyelids flutter down, what just happened? They're bored and uninterested? No. Probably not true at all. But their attention decision that they sat down with and started listening with for a few minutes just died. It's done. And they can't bring it back. Translate this to a student. They can't bring that attention decision back. So what do they have to do? They need a brain reset and a brand new decision, because a new decision is fresh, it's energetic, you can go for another 5 minutes. And then the eye flutter happens. So when you see students shifting in their seats, taking out a paper and starting to either write or fiddle, changing direction of their body, stretching their neck, schlucking a drink of water, they're doing brain resets. And they're doing them intuitively. Some students need to be taught, A, that it's okay to do a brain reset 5 minutes in because you just lost your focus, and B, how many different ways can you do them? And then if you start noticing this, look around. People do brain resets all the time. And the ones who do frequent brain resets keep their focus on whatever task is at hand much, much longer. Now, the other thing that most teachers, well, the good teachers know this, the ones that maybe aren't quite there yet might not know this. I don't care how many groups of people or what age you speak to as a teacher. And that's my background. I'm an educator as a background. When you have people not looking at you, you can almost say yes. They have found a focal point they're comfortable with, and it doesn't have to be you. But how many times do you see kids getting a little bit ridden in the, teachers ride a kid, come on, you're not paying attention, because they're staring off at something else. And I want to say, stop, they're fine. They're paying attention because they've shut down one input source, the visual, so that they can coordinate the auditory. Both together are too much. And for other people, if they don't hold the visual, they're lost. They can't take notes because they've got to keep the visual going. That's their coordination. So as we think about these things, think about the greater sensitivity and the greater precision of the autistic experience. And then some of these basics that all of us know become far more focused and far more interesting to understand, because you start to see the individuality expressing itself to you. So it gets to be pretty exciting. All right, now, the third one is production control, and the only reason that I want this on there is because there's something very important. Preview and review. Remember I told you that that one slide was so easy to explain? Think about what happened before, make a decision based on what you need to do in the moment. Preview and review is something that you will find most students, unless they're taught explicitly how to do this, it doesn't come naturally anymore. And I don't know quite why that is. I have a couple of ideas, but the sense of ability to reflect and preview, prepare, seems to be something that students don't do on their own, almost at any age. And the only ones that do are the ones that seem to have no difficulty or no challenges in the realm of their executive skills. So this is something I end up actually doing, that slow motion thing, taking it down and actually teaching review and preview as an explicit capacity. Now memory, I'm not going to spend any time on memory here, except to say we all know how memories are formed. All of us, we get it. But when you try to do these basic standard things, you need to remember that for the autistic person as well as the non-autistic person, their relationship to their sensory processing capacity is going to affect their ability to engage a memory. And the other thing that is going to be very, very difficult, and probably if I were to say the one thing that affects memory stronger than anything else, and that I don't think that most of us take seriously enough, is that one toward the bottom, which is make mental images of what you learn. I would have to say that over the last 30 or 40 years of working with students, I would say in my personal experience, the capacity to make a mental image has diminished dramatically, to the point where some students don't even know what you're talking about. When you say, what do you picture? Well, what do you mean, what do I picture? That is a strong statement for these kids. They don't know. So again, we're going by these things kind of quickly today because we only have an hour, but I just want you to know that's there. So now, all these different ways you can get memories in, how do you get them back out again? Do you need the same sensory access to get them back out? I would venture to say, yeah, you do. Now, what about organization and space? And I'm going to go a little bit through these now. But one of the things that I do with my work with executive skills with students is separate out their relationship to space, and therefore organization, from their relationship to time, and therefore planning. I actually separate the space-time continuum, so to speak. And one of the things that I work on sometimes for quite a good deal of time, no pun intended, is their understanding or their ability to picture time. You will find that, autistic or not, most students, I would say a surprising percentage, let's put it that way, don't know the order of the months of the year, don't know how to read an analog clock, can't tell you how many days are in a given month, and therefore when you ask them to picture how much time do you have between this assignment and its due date in 17 days, they'll say, I have no idea, it's due on Thursday. And they have no picture for what to do with that time. So if you combine organization with time management, it's too much. You need to separate them out because the time management is different from the organization capacity. And by putting them together all the time, we end up confusing the students and not really getting very far. Stop and go buttons, these are also very sensory driven, and what makes you initiate a behavior is not always easily visible. And that's where your translation skills or your intuitive skills are going to be really necessary. Taking just that simple example of the student who saw something out of order and became very distressed by that, then it looked like that student engaged in an initiative to behave in a certain way. So how are you going to inhibit that? You can't inhibit it if you don't know what caused it. You can inhibit it by simply coming down with more power over the child, but you can't actually properly inhibit that response unless you know what causes it. And we very often have a little bit too much access to the power buttons ourselves. Flexibility is one of those things, especially when it comes to autism, that you have to kind of acknowledge that autism manifests with a greater degree of sensitivity and precision. Therefore, moments of change are controlled by that response, which is very often perceived as stubbornness. But another one of those moments, slow the drop down, watch it slowly arrive, and see what form it makes. See what causes it. And you have a very different perception of it. Controlling emotions. This was another one of the executive skills that, again, everything that we've said so far, bring it to bear. What about the sensory experience? How much has been triggered, how much of the emotional response has been triggered by an unidentified sensory processing issue where the integration didn't happen and the coordination is barely able to get started? And then you start to see that some of the behaviors that we observe every day are differently understandable. Self-expression, self-control, self-knowledge, these are the things that we expect a child, now imagine, we're talking often about 10 and 12-year-olds here, to be able to do so that they can step up to the plate and self-advocate. I was just talking with one of the parents here just before we started. Self-advocacy even gets into the IEPs. On Friday, I'm going to be speaking to the Harford County Public School psychologists for their professional development day. And one of the things that we're going to be talking about is how do you get these executive functions into the IEP in a way that's useful. And one of the things that some parents see written up in an IEP is that the student may have these accommodations if they ask for them, if they self-advocate. And here's my problem with that. And you know, bear with me if I repeat myself. If we have a young baby, we make sure they're warm, fed, cared for, rested, protected, safe, soft, cuddled, whatever. You need it. If you're a young child, you get it. We consider that normal. We would be appalled by a parent who did not provide those basic experiences automatically. You walk in the door of first grade, and you will sit where you're told to sit. You will hang your coat up when you're told to hang it up. You will pee when you're told to pee. You will eat when you're told to eat. You will move when you're told to move. And in the rest of the time, you'll do what I tell you to do, which is listen and work. And by the way, you need to self-advocate. I need to know what you need. What? Where did the disconnect come into our way of working that we don't build teaching self-advocacy skills into our educational thinking? It goes so, the disconnect happens too quickly. And then if you put something like self-advocate into the IEP for a 10-year-old, and you haven't tracked where you have been teaching 10-year-old appropriate skill building activities, then you say, and by the way, you're in high school, you should have had this figured out by now, and we're going to completely ignore the fact that I don't care whether you have ASD or ADHD, you need to be able to step up to the plate and be self-responsible. Preferably as responsible as I am, or possibly more, because I know it's, you know, I don't want to do it. In the high school level, we forget that the ADHD student is matured 2 years slower, sometimes 3. And so we're asking skills of a 14-year-old who's come to the table with 11-year-old development. And it's not working. And so we just get a little bit more firm about it, but that doesn't help it work any better. So as we think about these things, that's why I like to dial it back a little bit and look at what's behind some of these issues, rather than talk about executive functions themselves. Because sometimes we go too quickly to the function, but we forget to build the toolbox. Control of behavior is one of the things that all of us as adults know, is that our own reaction response capacities are mildly under our control, possibly not fully under our control, and therefore we can only ask the students to learn this if we can demonstrate it, and that's hard. Okay, now setting goals is everything that has to do with executive function is goal setting. But it's goal setting in that way that I described earlier, which is the very simple way of saying, I have to make a decision. What was my previous experience? What will I decide for the next one? That's the goal right there. That happens so quickly, so frequently, so fast, that you almost can't even talk about it. All right, now, in the last few minutes that we have, the way that I set up the actual book that's on the table back there is that I started the book with the ingredients. And the reason I did that is because I can take a table full of ingredients, no matter what they are, and somebody says to me, we need a dinner or a breakfast or a sweet or a savory, and I can just cook it. I don't use recipe books. But the reason I can do that is because I know my ingredients. I have experience, I have understanding. The ingredients are relevant, and I know I can manage it. It would be the same if you gave somebody a toolbox and some materials and said, build a house. The people who know how to use the tools can picture the house, can plan it, can step their way through the engagement with those tools in an effective way, will be able to build the house, and everybody else will be able to say, okay, but what's this? And it's a hammer. How do I use a hammer? That house is not going to be built very well. What we are doing with our students is we're basically saying, you need a toolbox, and the best teachers are the ones that are saying, let me show you and teach you how to use the tools in your toolbox so that you can, in fact, in the end, build that house or cook that meal. Now, these are the tools, and in the book I actually put the ingredients at the beginning of the book. I didn't even talk about the executive functions until the second half. But in the toolbox, here are your ingredients, and I'm just going to very briefly go over them because the nature of today is not one that we can go into detail. But relationship got to the top of the list, and it's actually in the list of that top 1 and 2 are there for a reason. Imagine if relationship actually affects our ability to process our executive brain so strongly that a difficult relationship with a person, an activity, an environment isn't going well, all other systems shut down. And that's why I gave you that one example of the little boy who was shut down because things were out of order. The environment relationship didn't work and everything else shut down. Now, what if somebody had said something to that child that set him off? It would have been as much of a shutdown. So relationship actually is pretty powerful in its ability to prevent or enable the executive activities. Preview and review, as I said before, is so important that it has to be taught. It's not commonly, naturally known how to handle preview and review. For a student to understand their strengths and weaknesses, it sounds so easy. And this is an area where the ability of the teacher or parent to translate becomes absolutely crucial. I'll give you one very, very quick example. I asked a young woman who was in college once what her strengths and weaknesses were. And she said, my strengths are my friends. I've got such great friends. I said, well, okay, that's good. And she said, yeah, except that I'm, in essence, I'm a waste of space, but I've got great friends. And I said, how is that possible? And I drew a circle, that you could put this star, your friend, on that circle. And then on another part of the circle, another star, that's your friend. And then this big black blob, and that's you. Is it possible that that's all you have to offer those wonderful friends of yours? Do you think that they might see something different? That conversation changed the way she saw herself, because she was able to acknowledge that strengths are what other people see as well. You don't have to only be self-knowledge based when it comes to your strengths. So that's why we need each other, because people can see stuff in us that we can't see ourselves. That's something most students never figure out. Rhythm and routine. Rhythm and routine are wickedly misunderstood. If I were to ask you right now, what's the difference between rhythm and routine? Just briefly, what would you say? It's hard to answer, yeah.
Well, the time I get up in the morning and the process that I use to get through my morning preparation for the day.
Is what, rhythm or routine?
My routine.
That's your routine. Okay. What I would say is that rhythm is like the seasons of the year. Every spring comes around, but no two springs are the same. Your birthday comes around every year, but you never get the same birthday back twice. Routine is something that is actually a little more mechanical and can be really repeated in an exact order. It's where you see that the OCD goes a little bit in the direction, a big lot in the direction of routine. Routinized behaviors. You know, these kind of things that you see happening a lot. You have with the autistic person a lot of routinized behavior. And they have a much, much more difficult time with rhythm. So if you were to take the picture of a piano lesson, sitting down and you have 5 pieces to practice from your piano lesson, that is practice and rhythm. The routine is where you take the C major scale and you try to get it perfect, and you try to build in muscle memory, and you try to do it exactly the same every single time, 100 times over. That's routine. That is repetition. So I think when we use these things as tools, if we understand just that little bit of background, we'll understand them better. Self-advocacy we've talked about. Motivation and incentive. The most important thing to understand here is that the way that motivation works is that it's intrinsic, and no one can mess with someone else's motivation. So when you see comments written on report cards, the student isn't motivated, I want to take that back and sit the teacher down and say, you and I need to talk. I have never, ever met an unmotivated student. I have met students where I have no access to their motivation. But what motivates them, if they're awake and they're not in a coma, they are motivated by something. Now, incentive is what we use. We try to incentivize. Roland Barthes was quoted as saying, I never heard him say this, but it was said that he said this, our education system is based on learn or we will hurt you. Everything is incentive. Learn or we will give you a bad grade, we will send a note home to your parents, we will give you detention, we will prevent you from going to college, we will make you feel terrible about yourself. Learn or we will hurt you. We over-incentivize with rewards and punishments rather than acknowledge what the motivators are. With an autistic student, you'll find they are far more internally motivated by things that are difficult to identify for the outsider, and they're not very responsive to incentives. Implicit and explicit, we really don't have time to get into that, and whole to the parts and parts to the whole, but the reason that they're important is understanding. We expect a lot of implicit understanding from students. And when we make a mismatch of our communication with them, it's sometimes because we're expecting them to implicitly understand what we want to have them understand rather than explicitly giving it to them. And when it comes to whole to the parts and parts to the whole, that's much more of an educator's kind of thought process, but everybody has a tendency to think either whole and then fill in all the pieces, or fill in all the pieces and then finally see the whole. We all have tendencies in one or the other direction. That's a normal thing. So with those tools, what we end up doing, oh, sorry, that's where I used to live, but now I'm out. With those tools, we end up being able to understand that fundamentally grasping how executive skills work in a given student means a different way of perceiving, a different way of interpreting, and understanding how any given moment is being processed by that student through that salutogenic, do they understand what's happening to them? Is it relevant? And can they handle it? Can they manage it? So with that in mind, knowing that the autistic person has greater degrees of precision and sensitivity, it's possible that you'll start seeing things just a little bit differently now. And that will give you the insight that you need to work with any student that comes your way. So with that, I think we're going to turn the camera off and then you can ask specific questions.